Hello again. One of the most tiresome rituals which have in recent years arisen in connection with St George's Day is the number of left-wing smart alecks who always pop up on April the 22nd and remind everybody smugly that St George was not actually an Englishman at all. They are like precocious children who have learned something at school and are eager to show off by telling grown-ups about it. Of course, the adults already knew all this, but they smiled politely at the youngsters. This is how many of us feel about the people who claim that St George was really Turkish, Greek, or, and this is a very popular one this year, Palestinian. His supposed tomb is actually at Lod in Israel. There are, of course, people who do not apparently understand the concept of symbolism and metaphor. I am only surprised that they have not yet thought of explaining to us that dragons are not real, and so St George could not really have slain one. Many of us like to have focal points of various kinds for our identity. Christians have the cross, Muslims the crescent, and Jews the Magen David. We have flags too, buildings, famous historical characters, and also stories and myths. These are things which bind a people together, and those sort of symbols are important to a nation. That is why on April the 23rd, English people like to remember that they are English, and to consider what that means. This is the significance of the image of St George, for he represents chivalry and knightly virtues. The story is, of course, that St George came to a city which was menaced by a dragon. The inhabitants had been sending the beast a couple of sheep regularly, but when they ran out of sheep, they began sacrificing young women instead. The king's daughter was the latest to be given to the dragon, and St George arrived in the nick of time and rescued her by slaying the creature, an act for which he would accept no reward. One of the reasons that England adopted St George as their saint was that this story struck a chord with the medieval mind. Here was a man who was fearless and brave, but used his bravery to protect the weak. He rescued a girl from danger. He did this not because he expected or wanted a reward, but simply because it was the right thing to do. It was an act of heroism carried out altruistically, just for the sake of it. This is the very image of the ideal Englishman who lives by the code of chivalry. He is brave and strong, but protects the helpless and weak, especially women. He does this for no mercenary reason, but simply because that is playing the game. It is this idealised image of the knight which gave rise to some of the most stirring examples of bravery in this country's history. I wonder how many viewers have heard of the Birkenhead drill. This is the origin of the phrase women and children first when a ship is in difficulties. When the troopship HMS Birkenhead struck a rock and began to sink off the coast of Africa, this was in 1852, there were on board, in addition to hundreds of soldiers, the wives and children of some officers. There were not enough lifeboats, and so the order was given for the men to parade on deck and stand still, while the women and children were helped into the lifeboats. Even when the ship went down, the men stood to attention because any attempt to rush the lifeboats would have resulted in their being swamped. Hundreds of them drowned. This then was the English ideal, men who were resolute and brave, prepared to die if it meant they could save women and children by their deaths. The Birkenhead disaster was a true instance of chivalry in the real world, and such incidents became revered as typifying how a real Englishman should conduct himself. This is why St George's Day is special, not because St George was English, he wasn't, but because he set the standard by which English men should live and die, as though they were chivalrous knights. Of course, these days the idea of chivalry and sacrifice are widely mocked and seen as being horribly old-fashioned. In today's England, it's everybody for his or herself, and the weakest are often left behind or trampled underfoot. As for respecting women and trying to take care of them, this is now regarded as rank sexism. However, it does no harm once a year to reflect upon those old English ideals and for us to consider St. George and his character.